The plane pitched to the left and began to descend. A diorama flashed into view through a break in the cloud cover. Low cabins standing in puddles of pea-green grass, a pond and a sluiceway, and some obsolete factory buildings dreaming in pasture land. Then fog rolled in from somewhere below. Sheremetyevo Airport, a linoleum labyrinth lit dimly by fluorescence, was watched over by soldiers barely out of their teens, who leaned languidly against the walls, assault rifles slung over their shoulders. I waited beside a church group from Michigan, half a dozen families in pristine white sneakers, who joked heartily with one another, as though they were waiting out a lull at the Department of Motor Vehicles back home. Just then, their American sense of inviolability reassured me. My case of nerves, I knew, was shared by many Soviet immigrants returning to the motherland. The worry that the gates won't open again when it's time to leave. The customs inspector's opaque, somehow familiar faces professionally immune to interpretation, told me that liberties I hadn't questioned the previous morning were now granted and revoked at the whim of these men, and men in other different uniforms. In my Levi's and windbreaker, I blended in with the church group, but I was a returning refugee, a category of traveler the customs men regarded with suspicion and possibly envy. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other and strained to pick up scraps of conversation. When my turn came, I stepped up to the window and slid my passport under the glass. The inspector, 50-ish with a comb-over, didn't look up. When his eyes moved across the column of text that read, "Place of birth, Russia," the corners of his mouth widened into a foreshadowing of a grin. He stamped the passport, slid it back, and looking up at last said, "Welcome home, Mr. Halberstadt." Later that afternoon, my father and I sat in his kitchen smoking. I'd quit cigarettes in college, but I pulled on one of his Winstons, watching the smoke drift to the ceiling, where it was forming a storm cloud. My father had been smoking since he was 16. He was remarried and had a college-age daughter, and had never recovered completely from the heart attack he'd suffered nearly 15 years earlier. "Why don't you quit smoking?" I prodded. He said he would quit when things get easier, and that he was crazy about cigarettes. We both knew things wouldn't get easier, and that he wasn't going to get any less crazy, so I lit up in guilty solidarity. My father liked the brand of vodka called Peter the Great, and on that first day in Moscow I drank enough to begin liking it too. My father and I hadn't seen each other in 7 years. I wondered if I'd recognize him, thinking of the way some men in their late 50s begin to look elderly almost overnight. But my father looked as I'd remembered him, still handsome and confoundingly fit, only his temples were grayer and the lines around his eyes more pronounced. We spent nearly the entire day talking in the kitchen, but to me our voices sounded tentative and oddly formal. Since I'd left Russia, we'd spoken occasionally over a sputtering long-distance phone line and met a handful of times, adding up to maybe 3 or 4 weeks spent together over 2.5 decades. Unlike that of most fathers and sons, our relationship hadn't been worn into a recognizable shape by familiarity. We were closely related strangers. To my frustration, I once again became quiet and strangely passive around my father, a condition exacerbated by my shortage of Russian words to describe adult emotions. Well, not a shortage of words exactly. What I lacked was the ability to put them together in ways that enabled adult modes of conversation: irony, doubt, tenderness, reserve. And so in my father's presence I spoke less than I did otherwise, and was cowed by my silence, which in turn made me feel not only mute but dumb.